Hello, everybody. Welcome into today's stream. I think we have a fantastic show today. Dr. Cindy Banyai will be joining to discuss her congressional run in Florida, and we have quite a few stories today that are near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk some media censorship. We're going to go into the continuation of Israel's war crimes. We're going to discuss some democratic politics and a number of other things today. I did want to actually start, though, by showing you guys here a tweet from our terrific COO, Jules, about why MMT is so important. She says, as progressive MMT activists and educators, we are never asking other progressives to put down their swords, only to pause and allow us to sharpen them for you so you can cut through all the neoliberal bullshit. Learn MMT, solidarity, etc., etc. If you do not follow Jules, her Twitter handle there up on the screen, I encourage you to. She is fantastic. And this tweet, I think, says what us MMT activists feel and sometimes maybe can't communicate in such a short space. We're often treated as though we are, opposing progressive policy prescriptions by pointing out, economic restrictions on things and how best to implement economic policies or progressive policies. So it's really important to point out that MMTers are really trying to sharpen the swords of progressive activists, not trying to dull them or combat their actions. So this is a fantastic tweet, and I just wanted to make sure to bring that to everybody because it's such an important issue. Also wanted to quickly plug some real progressive stuff. If you guys don't follow our other shows, Macro and Cheese podcast comes out every Saturday morning. We have the new Untouchables series that we're working on another season of, and a whole bunch of other great content that I would encourage you guys to go check out. We also have, I mentioned this last week, but the March for Medicare for All that is occurring in a whole bunch of cities around the country on July 24th. It started as Seattle, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Detroit then was added, and now so many cities that I cannot even keep track have added themselves to this march. So if you want to look up, if a city near you is participating and go out and march in the streets for Medicare for All, I want to encourage everybody to do that. Anyone who's interested in getting involved in organizing, please look into March for Medicare for All and the organizers and see what you can do to help. We also will be streaming this event, going to various cities and things and talking Medicare for All with some experts and things like that. So really encourage everybody to check that out on July 24th. So to dive into some of the stories I wanted to talk about today, we're going to start with an absolutely horrendous tweet from Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu, who encouraged Joe Biden to effectively favor certain countries over others as it pertains to spreading vaccines, getting vaccines around the world. Ted Lieu says, I strongly disagree with the Biden administration on their global vaccine rollout. We should help our allies first instead of letting a third party decide where vaccines should go. Since there are not enough vaccines, should we help India or Iran? We should help India first. So effectively, Ted Lieu saying, because Iran does not get along with us, we should favor other countries over them. We should punish Iranian citizens because their government and our government do not get along. I find that to be utterly barbaric and ridiculous. I also want to point out that Ted Lieu has in his bio right here, also, empathy is good. Well, if empathy is good, Ted, then maybe empathize with Iranian citizens who you're basically saying we should screw over and let die in favor of other countries. The answer here also is it's not mutually exclusive. And that's part of the misframing of this entire thing. This has to do with the TRIPS waiver, and one of the few good things that Joe Biden has done is support waiving, the TRIPS waiver, which would basically force vaccine producers to supply their recipes, if you will, to other producers around the world, which would expedite the process of getting these vaccines to everybody. And I've discussed this before, but I think it's really worth driving home. It's, first of all, a moral issue. It's an ethical issue. If you don't support impoverished countries being vaccinated, like, that's an ethical issue. I have a problem with that, right? But even if you're in this very sort of selfish mentality of you care about your country first and whatever, well, America might be getting close to pretty well vaccinated, and we might have good numbers on this stuff. But when you look around the world, there's like 100 countries that haven't given a shot or have hardly given any shots. and it's the impoverished countries, right? What that ends up doing is potentially creating variants of COVID that render the current vaccines completely ineffective. So what does that mean for the United States or the UK or Canada or any of these other, wealthier nations that are able to use their leverage over these companies to vaccinate their citizens as quickly as possible, right? That means as soon as the variants come around, then we're going to have potentially like a seasonal COVID situation where what variant is it this year? We got to go get vaccinated again, or we got to all mask up and isolate again. Um, so even if you're looking at this in a very selfish context, you should support vaccinating the entire world or as much of it as possible, as quickly as possible. And that means going forward with the TRIPS waiver. It is currently the EU largely that is holding this up. And it's actually kind of a funny dynamic, I think, because traditionally the United States is holding something like this up and the European Union is pushing for it, traditionally, typically. And right now it's the exact opposite. It's the European Union that is holding up what would be a progressive and a forward thinking policy, while the United States actually for once supports a policy that would help impoverished countries. There was some great reporting by the Daily Poster about how big pharma is trying to influence high ranking members in the European Union and trying to keep them from going forward with the TRIPS waiver. The European Union, again, currently does not support the TRIPS waiver. So big pharma doing everything they can to keep it that way and make sure that, the Pfizers and Modernas and Johnson & Johnsons of the world get to make every last penny that they possibly can off of this pandemic. It's an egregious incentive structure. And this is another reason that, we need to severely restructure how we go about these kinds of things. It's obviously public health very important, right? I have nothing but love and respect for the scientists that actually put the work in to create these vaccines, right? But I have a serious issue with Pfizer and with Moderna and how they conduct themselves in such rapacious, greedy, reckless ways. Complete disregard for human life, right? These big pharma companies will cause addiction problems and overdoses and all these kinds of things, side effects that end up killing people or significantly decreasing their quality of life, and they never give a shit. They actually build into their budgets when they're creating a new drug. They try to estimate how much are we going to get sued for this, and build that into their budgeting process. So instead of oh, there might be something here that's dangerous that we should, reconsider as we roll this medication out. Instead of that, it's how much are we going to get sued for, and can we still profit off of it? The whole incentive structure is ass backwards, and that includes these vaccines. I've seen Pfizer executives getting all giddy at the prospect of booster shots every year, getting all giddy at the prospect of variants that force them to create new vaccines, because for them, that is a opportunity for profit. So anyway, Ted Lieu here with an absolutely horrendous, egregious, barbaric take. And for him to say empathy matters in his bio is hilarious when you put it in the context of this particular tweet. I wanted to show you guys my favorite response to this as well. This is from Paul F. Tompkins. He says, if we're going to be holding the entire population of a country responsible for its stupid government, we should have gotten our own vaccine last. Damn straight. If you're going to hold the barbarity of a government against its own people, then the United States should be last on the list. There's not a country can even touch us or come close when it comes to how much damage, how much harm we inflict upon the rest of the world with our foreign policy, with our trade policy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So if we're going to do this, hold the citizens accountable for their government's nonsense, then the United States should be last on the list for in vaccine priority. Yet we are one of the most vaccinated countries in the world per capita. So fantastic response there from Paul Tompkins. It's Ted here just completely ignoring his own government's shortcomings and wanting to hold innocent civilians accountable for Iran's government's shortcomings. It's egregious. There's nothing about that that's remotely okay. And Ted Lieu, he's a politician. He's much more establishment than I would like, but he does tend to have some progressive bends sometimes. And I was quite surprised that he, of all people, would think it's okay to tweet something as brazen as this. And again, this huge issue, you guys, because in a year or two, we very likely will be dealing with variants that are a result of our unwillingness to expedite the process of vaccinating the entire world. So Also wanted to cover a story here about Tom Perez. I'm sure that many of you remember Tom. He was the labor secretary under Barack Obama for a while, and he also was one of the worst DNC chairs of all time. Tom, we all know what happened behind the scenes. He continued what Debbie Wasserman Schultz was doing in terms of using every backdoor alley that he could to screw over Bernie Sanders, right? To ensure that one of the establishment-friendly candidates takes the nomination, to effectively, strip Bernie Sanders of his right to run for office in a fair way. Tom Perez, absolutely terrible, and he also this is just my own little issue with Tom, but when you hear him, he's like one of the most vacuous politicians that I have ever seen in my entire life. Everything he says is about like, well, if we base our policy in our values, he says the word values like every other fucking word, and it's one of those just like vapid platitudes that means absolutely nothing, but that people hear and go, oh yeah, values. You know what I mean? That means whatever you want it to mean. It's kind of like Make America Great Again, where it's like that's totally subjective, and what I think is great is what I'm going to apply to the phrase, right? It just totally vapid nonsense, right? Anyway, that's Tom Perez for you. But we have an update here on what he is doing now, participating in that good old revolving door. This is in Jacobin. It's by Andrew Perez and Walker Bragman. Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez just joined an anti-union law firm. Former DNC chair and Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez just joined a law firm that brags about its lawyers who regularly counsel and train clients on union avoidance. Another member of an administration that posed as progressive, yet was anything but. And I just want to point out, you guys, he was literally the labor secretary under Obama. And now he's joining a law firm that specializes in squashing unions. This is how far right the Democratic Party has drifted on these economic issues. This is indicative of what the establishment Democrats actually feel on labor politics. This is a continuation of Clinton's New Democrat idea of pivoting towards neoliberal economic policies and embracing sort of a Reaganistic approach to the economy. And now we have people who portray themselves as progressives, joining anti-union law firms and squashing Bernie Sanders' campaign and all this kind of stuff. So going on here, former Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez announced on Thursday that he's joining the law firm Venable LLP, whose website boasts that its lawyers regularly counsel and train clients on union avoidance. Perez, who was the Democratic National Committee chair until January, joins a growing number of Obama officials who cashed in their government experience with jobs at union-busting companies. That list includes Press Secretaries Jay Carney, who became the top flack at Amazon, and Robert Gibbs, who spent several years as a top flack for McDonald's. Obama senior advisor David Plouffe served as policy chief at Uber, while former senior advisor Valerie Jarrett has a board seat, at Lyft. Rather than avoid issues he oversaw as labor secretary, Perez said in a press release he will be working specifically on those issues. So in other words, he's going to be working specifically in labor politics for an anti-union law firm. He's admitting his position here, his rhetorical position here was bullshit from the start. That he was never friendly to the labor movement, that he was never on the side of workers, that he was never on the side of union organizers. He was always on the side of corporations. And now he's joining a law firm to serve said corporations. So, this isn't terribly surprising for those who know Tom Perez or have followed his career. But it's definitely worth pointing out that all of these ex-Obama officials and really Obama, but it will be Biden too, and ex-Clinton officials. This is a continuation of a pattern. And that's obviously, you guys, not to obviously the Republican presidents have advisors that contribute or participate in this revolving door as well. But as a lefty, I'm going to critique the Democrats for it. You know what I mean? Like, the Democrats are supposed to represent me. So when they rhetorically tweet and give interviews where they come off as some sort of progressive or some sort of labor-friendly politician, and then they turn around and join a law firm like this, it's very much worth pointing out, because people need to understand that they cannot just believe the political theater and the rhetoric that all of these politicians will espouse. Someone like Chuck Schumer is a great example of this, you guys, where he will tweet all the time as though he's some sort of a progressive, because I think he's terrified that AOC is going to primary him. And then when you look at his actual record, it's like, dude, you're basically gatekeeping for the Republicans. You're disallowing the Overton window from going left of this point, and then you're trying to portray yourself as being left of the point that you're gatekeeping. It's again just really egregious the way that this is done. And we currently have a situation where the Democrats have the White House, the Senate, and the House. I understand the Senate is by slim margins, but they have the White House, the Senate, and the House, and they continue to break promises from the campaign anyway, even though they have all this authority, even on things that Joe Biden could do executive orders on. So this is what it's really about, you guys. They're all playing their own game to participate in this revolving door that ends up serving the wealthy class, the donor class, the corporations, the banks, etc. Right? All of this corruption that leads to the issues that we talk about on a regular basis is sort of fed by public officials who have leverage and power within their party and within their government behaving like this. And the problem is not that Tom Perez does this. The problem is that that's not unusual. He's not a rarity. That's normal, right? So this isn't a one-off. It's not an exception to the rule. This is very common practice, right? I'm sure many of you are well aware of that. So one more story that I want to get to here before bringing my guest in. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein is a very important story in my view because of the connection that he has to powerful people. And I think some people, like obviously disgusting what he did. He's a pedophile and he engaged in sex trafficking and rape. And I mean, just aberrant and disgusting. I think everybody agrees with that. Where I get really interested in this story as it pertains to the bigger picture is Epstein's connections to the royal family, to the Clintons, to the Trumps, etc. And his sort of ability to financially profit off of that and benefit other rich people who he was friends with through his connections. So I think it's worth noting that somebody like Bill Gates could go to any bank in the world and they would take his money, right? Any bank, any investor, anyone in the world would take his money, right? Billionaire, multi-hundred billionaire. Yet he clearly felt the need to associate with Jeffrey Epstein. Whether or not that was for the child abuse, I have no idea. But even if we assume it's not, this is where I still think this is really egregious. I think there are a lot of powerful people who wanted to associate with Epstein, not even necessarily for the sex stuff, but because Epstein has the kind of power and connections that he has. So you may have access to information from somebody like that your average investor or even big time investor or bank would not have access to, right? If you know the royal family, if you know the sitting president of the United States, if you know a bunch of senators and congressmen, you may have access to inside information that is beneficial in a financial sense, right? So I'm fascinated by the connections between the powerful and Epstein and what kind of conduct he was engaging in on a financial basis, right? And how that may have affected our society. But this update is really something else. The guards that were sleeping while Epstein committed suicide have basically been silenced and disallowed from coming forward with that. So this is in the Daily Mail. I know the Daily Mail. This is part of my objection is that this does not get a lot of coverage. So I have to go to a source like the Daily fucking Mail. Anyway, Jeffrey Epstein prison guards who slept while he committed suicide plan to tell court that falsifying records was routine before striking plea deal. The prison guards who slept while Jeffrey Epstein hanged himself planned to defend themselves as scapegoats of a dysfunctional system if they had gone to trial, sources have revealed. Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, who admitted sleeping and browsing the internet instead of watching the billionaire pedophile the night he killed himself in the New York jail cell last week, avoided time behind bars in exchange for their cooperation and community service. The pair had been charged with lying on prison records to make it seem as though they had made required checks on the sex offender before he was found in his cell in August 2019. So essentially, you guys, instead of going to trial where some of this stuff may have been revealed, they ended up giving them a plea deal to avoid having that information come out. This is how the system protects itself, right? If that was your average citizen and it wasn't someone connected to Jeffrey Epstein, that would have gone differently, right? And there's also questions about the actual incident itself, right? If they were sleeping and browsing the internet, where was the accountability for that? Jeffrey Epstein was supposed to be on like close watch. He was on suicide watch. So they're supposed to be very vigilant about how they are, watching him and ensuring that he can't harm himself. And yet they, in that particular context, when they know he's on suicide watch, they're asleep and they're browsing the internet. There's some systemic failure there, or some intentional quote unquote failure. So I'm just really fascinated by this story in general and the lack of coverage. I think it says a lot about the media and their unwillingness to engage in stories that might cut into their access to certain sources. So if you're a big time media outlet and you want to make sure to maintain a relationship with the royal family because you'd like to interview the royal family, you might not cover this. If you want a relationship with the Clintons or the Trumps, you might not cover this, right? How many celebrities went on trips with Epstein? So we get into this place of access journalism where somebody who's powerful enough can get away with the most disgusting and egregious behaviors, in our society that we like. Killing someone, raping someone, child abuse. These are like the worst of the worst, right? The worst of the worst. He gets to get away with that because of his connections. And not only does he get to get away with it from a legal or criminal perspective, he gets to get away scot-free in terms of the media. Now, obviously, his reputation is ruined because this got out. But the legacy media outlets covered it in a very particular way, if they covered it at all. So instead of going into the actual big picture of the story, they would just cover some specific update about his court proceedings or something, as though it's some like banal hearing that doesn't matter at all, right? Or some random person. And they also, I want to point out, this is a great example of how the media can use incorrect words in their framing. They would say things like, oh, Epstein is accused of having unconsensual sex with minors. There is no such thing as unconsensual sex with minors. What that is rape. That's child rape. So call it child rape. But the media did this thing where they bend over backwards when it's someone like Epstein to present it rhetorically as nicely and softly as possible, right? Reminds me a lot of the outcries about calling what Israel is doing ethnic cleansing. That's what it is. It meets the textbook dictionary definition of ethnic cleansing. That is what Israel is engaging in. So for us to call it ethnic cleansing is simply an accurate description. But then everyone gets all up in arms about like, oh, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. So it reminds me of Epstein in that sense, where it's like, no, he's a rapist. He's not accused of unconsensual sex with a minor. He's a child trafficker and a rapist. He conditioned women to be his sex slaves of sorts. Like we have to call this stuff what it is and not allow someone just because they're powerful to get away with the soft rhetoric about their crimes, right? So again, I'm kind of astounded by the lack of coverage on this particular story, and I hope it will pick up if more information comes out. But it appears that the two guards who may have actually had some information to give about the systemic failures of his death, it appears that they are now silenced and unable to share their piece and tell the court what actually occurred, what actually broke down to lead to such an incident, right? So very quickly here, I'm going to show you guys one clip. This is a journalist of Al Jazeera being arrested and assaulted by IDF forces in Sheikh Jarrah. So this is an example of the continuation of Israel's war crimes and how when we have a ceasefire, that does not mean that the problem that Palestinians face has ended. It simply means we're back to the illegal occupations without the daily bombings, right? So it's just a slightly less aggressive version of the same crimes that Israel's been committing for decades. Anyway, here is a clip from Al Jazeera.
So with the number of different angles of this incident that we've seen coming in, we've found one which shows as much of the incident as possible. I'm going to play it for you in full with full sound.
Just stop! Don't touch! Don't touch! Don't touch! Don't touch! I will not leave! Don't touch! Don't touch!
يلا 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 أخوها أخوها.
Don't touch!
תודה רבה, זהו.
What are you doing? No, you don't have the permission. My hand! Give me! Don't touch! Don't touch! Don't touch! Enough! Enough!
Right. So you saw it for yourself there. Let's play it again. This is a journalist, our journalist. Is that a woman who is harassing Israeli security forces or who is being harassed by them? You can hear her shouting, "Don't touch. Don't touch." And then I think this moment is telling. Someone's putting their hand over the camera because they don't want us to see this. But it is clear as day, high definition pictures, no grainy mobile phone picture here. This is a journalist being assaulted by the forces of the Israeli government.
So you guys can see pretty clear example of suppressing journalism. And then I agree with the host there, that putting a hand up to the camera like that makes pretty obvious that you understand what's going on behind you is egregious and unacceptable and, you know, barbaric. I apologize for my camera app, you guys. It'll come back in a second. That incident is not, again, this is not a one-off. This is not an exception to the general rule. The rule is that Israel behaves this way towards journalists that they think might be revealing things that they don't want the world to see. And as I've talked about before, the hope that I do find on this issue is that we have seen a significant rhetorical shift in the United States. And the United States has more leverage over Israel than any other country by a very wide margin. Most all of their weapons come from us, and a lot of their funding and aid comes from us. Their geopolitical positioning, their sort of safety in the region kind of depends on our foreign policy. You know, the Arab countries in the region that have allied with Israel did so because they did not want to piss off the United States. So we have this kind of stranglehold over the entire dynamic right now in Israel. And it would take one phone call from Joe Biden to end the illegal occupation, to end this kind of conduct towards journalists, to get this situation under control. And instead, what he has done is continue to provide them with more weapons. He has continued to allow them to kill, it was 60-some children in a couple of weeks. He's allowed them to bomb journalistic outlets, bomb hospitals, roads to hospitals, bomb the only COVID testing center in Palestine. This kind of stuff is internationally illegal, and it's not even close. Those are war crimes. You belong at the Hague. So also just want to touch on Israel is getting a new prime minister. It's going to be Bennett taking over for Netanyahu, and it's a new coalition government. But I just want to make really clear that Bennett's even further right than Netanyahu is, and that's really saying something. Naftali Bennett is a literal, like he embraces the Zionist movement. He served in the Israeli military and participated in settlements in the West Bank. And he openly supports the idea that Israelis should be able to go take this land, participate in what has been deemed universally as illegal settlements and illegal occupation. He just openly supports it. So we aren't getting a better situation because Netanyahu has been ousted. We're just getting a different prime minister who has horrendous views, potentially even worse views on this conflict than Netanyahu did. So just, you know, this is a conflict that I think we could talk about almost, you know, every stream, and obviously has heated up recently. I think Israel wanted to test the Biden administration's response, quite frankly, and see how they would respond to the escalation that Israel engaged in over previous weeks. And I again just really want to drive in, you guys. When a society is being victimized by an illegal occupation, when a society is being, when you're being victimized by literal ethnic cleansing, like borderline genocide kind of behavior, when that's happening, a ceasefire really doesn't mean shit, because Israel just gets to continue with what they've been doing for decades that is the root of this problem, right? I mean, we can go around in circles about the complications of the origination of this problem, but right now it is clear as day what's going on. One side is the most powerful military in the Middle East, backed by the United States and all of our allies. That side is using that force against people who do not have that kind of military technology and organization and geopolitical backing or anything close. So what it is not a battle or a war or a conflict. What it is ethnic cleansing and an illegal occupation. And to throw your hand up like that while you're arresting a journalist is indicative that the soldiers on the ground full well understand how this stuff would look and full well understand that they are not on the correct side of this issue. It's sad to see this kind of stuff continuing when the United States has the kind of leverage that they had. But as I mentioned before, Joe Biden is the single largest recipient of Israeli lobby money in U.S. political history. And that is obviously a strong contributor to our current policy. Also on the top, I know it's an arbitrary number to pick, but the top 11 all time includes Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, and, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name, Dick Durbin, who's one of the top ranking Democratic senators. So you got like 3 of the top, 5 or 6 most powerful senators who are in the top 11 all time in Israeli lobby money. And you have a president who's number 1 all time in Israeli lobby money. This is the result, you guys. This is, AIPAC is one of the largest contributors to Congress. This is what they're buying. They're buying our support in their crimes. And that needs to be explicitly called out. And the fact that to again tie it in, I mentioned this earlier with the Epstein thing, that needs to be called out in accurate language, not watered down, soft milquetoast bullshit. It needs to be called out as it is: illegal occupation, ethnic cleansing, genocide. You're murdering children. You're committing war crimes. Okay. So that needs to be discussed in a proper way, and not a way that lets Israel off for their crimes in the same way that the press tries to kind of let Jeffrey Epstein off for his crimes. Moving on to our next story here. I'm going to talk a little bit later about media censorship, and I'm sure that some of you know Krystal and Saagar and their leaving the Hill, and the reasons for that have to do with the Hill constraining who they can have on and what they can say. And I think Rising was a pretty terrific show as far as a corporate media show goes, but they left because they have some integrity, and I want to applaud them for that. But anyway, we're going to get into that story a little bit later. I wanted to mention that now because I'm actually going to show you guys a clip from Rising with the new hosts, but it's Brianna Joy Gray who went on as the guest, and Brianna Joy Gray is absolutely fantastic. She was Bernie Sanders' press secretary, and now she is in media. She's a co-host of the Bad Faith podcast with Virgil Texas. And, Brianna just calls it like it is and has no time for nonsense. So she's talking here about the Democratic Party's unwillingness to go forward with the agenda, even the agenda items that they had promised on the campaign, despite the fact that they have as much power as they do. So we'll watch this couple minutes of Brianna on Rising and come back and discuss.
Brianna, you said, and some of you said, we're being too cynical when we said the corporate Democrats didn't want to accomplish anything. That's in response, you can see, to the statement on Manchin and Sinema's moves here, saying that there are actually more Democrats than just Manchin and Sinema behind the scenes who are opposed to some of these negotiations. Break that down for us. What do you think about the sort of corporate Democrats' handling of the negotiations? And then what do you think progressive Democrats that might actually be in Congress involved in these negotiations, how do you think they should approach this process?
Yeah. So the prevailing narrative in this country, at least among Democrats, is that we could have good things but for obstruction from the Republican Party. And when we're in a moment like this one, where we have a united Democratic government, a Democrat in the White House, a Democratic House, and Democratic Senate, the villain has to be somewhat diversified so that Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, two of the most conservative Democrats in the Senate, have been singled out as obstructing all of the good legislation that Democrats would otherwise pass. However, what this article, this reporting reveals is that the depth of disagreement among Democrats, the depth to which there are more than just two Democrats who aren't on board with an agenda that frankly reflects the interest of a bipartisan majority of Americans, goes a lot deeper than just Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And the extent to which Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have been put out there by the Democratic Party to take all of the heat for Joe Biden not passing this kind of progressive legislation, it's really all a bit of a cloak and dagger that covers the extent to which we have two corporate parties, neither of which is especially invested in doing the things that Americans want them to do.
I was just going to ask you on that point exactly. Do you believe that establishment Democrats are essentially using Manchin and Sinema as cover to sort of get away behind the scenes without taking that fire themselves, with, pushing back on some of the more progressive elements that are being suggested? But what some establishment Democrats are essentially doing, I mean, you work in politics, you work in Democratic politics, you know these people. Is that what they're doing here? They're just using Manchin and Sinema as cover?
Absolutely. I mean, the reporting here was pretty explicit, but we've been making that argument, for example, over at Bad Faith Podcast for a long time now. And you saw it in machinations like those around the $15 minimum wage. The way that issue was reported was a straightforward, oh, well, we don't have the votes for it. The conservative Democrats refused to vote for it. And of course, we can't get 10 Republicans on board either. But when you look more closely at procedurally how it played out, what happened was there was an objection from conservative Democrats. But at the end of the day, Chuck Schumer chose to take the $15 minimum wage out of the bill preemptively, so that there was never actually an up-down vote that the senators would have to stand behind and defend to their constituents. The vote that was taken was on whether or not to reintroduce a $15 minimum wage back into the COVID relief bill, which would have required 60 votes, unlike the original up-down vote, which would have only taken 50 plus one, the tiebreaker vote, which of course the Democrats have. So again, you see one of these machinations where all of the procedural issues, talking about the parliamentarian, all of that conversation is used to disguise the extent to which Joe Biden and the Democrats could act if they wanted to, not even getting into the extent to which there are a number of things that Joe Biden could do by executive order, which he has said he doesn't want to do on principle. What that principle is beyond me.
So, Brianna, they're kind of breaking down how there are a number of other senators who are behind closed doors saying, we really don't support these particular policies. And then, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema's willingness to sort of go forward and be the face of we're going to stop this is then utilized by the other senators who and members of the Biden administration who may be less enthusiastic about some more left-leaning policies. So Brianna does fantastic work. She calls it like it is, and I encourage you all to follow her work if you don't already. At this point, I would love to bring in my guest today. Dr. Cindy Banyai is running for Congress in Florida, and we are excited to talk to her today about her campaign. So, Cindy, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yes, Luke, thanks for having me here.
So if you just wanted to start by kind of explaining your background. I looked up your bio on your website, and you have quite an interesting set of experiences. You've kind of studied social sciences on a micro and a macro level. You've studied abroad and things like that. So can you just kind of introduce yourself and how you got into politics and your journey, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Dr. Cindy Banyai, the Democratic candidate for U.S. House of Representatives, Florida 19. I'm a teacher and a business owner, and I'm fighting for our water, our health, and our jobs. And I have been somebody who's been very interested in public service for most of my life. And I've put my career and my education first to be the best qualified candidate I could possibly be when it was ready in my life. And that's where we are right now. So I actually got my start on Capitol Hill while I was in college, working for both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. And from there, I continued my education in international relations, studying and getting my master's and my PhD in Japan, and studying community development. So the very, very micro, like Luke was talking about, as well as the connections to the global policies that we have. And I moved back to the US then and started building my family and my business, mostly helping nonprofits. And that's where I really got a good understanding of the things that our community wants and needs, because those are the services that the nonprofits are providing. And I was just very disappointed to see the corruption in our government and the fact that most of the people who are serving in our government simply did not care about the people in our community. And I decided to run for Congress to use my skills and my experience helping nonprofits and helping regular people here in Southwest Florida.
There we go. Sorry, everybody. Thank you. I was saying I think it's great to hear you say that, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who are involved in politics today, whether this is kind of explicit and malicious or whether this is just kind of falling into the way things work, end up serving a very particular class and serving, the corporate class, the banks, et cetera, et cetera. And even if that's not, again, intentional or corrupt or whatever, it just kind of, there's this general consensus on a lot of these issues, right? Where people fall in line. And so I'm really glad to hear that you're big on community. Can you talk a little bit about your district? What is your district like? And, politically, how do they vote? What kind of a district are you running in?
So this is Southwest Florida, Congressional District 19. Currently, we go from Boca Grande all the way down to Marco Island. It was gerrymandered specifically to be a very Republican-safe district. That's why we're all coastal instead of some of the rural and working class areas of our community here in Southwest Florida. And it was a Republican plus 13 going into the 2020 cycle. And with me as a candidate and with our fantastic work of the local Democratic parties, we were actually able to move the district 1 point in the Democratic direction in that cycle. Only 5 districts across the state of Florida did that. So that's something I'm very proud of and very hopeful that we'll be able to reach more people in the 2022 cycle, that is.
Yeah. So something about Florida that I find absolutely fascinating is that it seems to kind of generally lean red, even though sometimes it's kind of purple. But then on some of these direct democracy issues, they'll like overwhelmingly support a raise to the minimum wage, or so how do you maybe use that dynamic to speak to working class and impoverished people who may have a different cultural view or some different ideas about social issues or identity politics, these kinds of things? How do you maybe use the socioeconomics that Florida does seem to embrace to kind of reach a working class audience and bring your message to them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Here in the state of Florida, we passed 2 constitutional amendments by over 60%. And that was the minimum wage, the $15 minimum wage, as well as the medical marijuana, both of which are typically seen as relatively progressive issues. And yet the votes for Democrats lag behind those progressive issues, which is fascinating. For me, what I look at and I understand about how regular people are is they're not really involved in policy. They really buy some of these lies, hook, line, and sinker, that particularly Republicans sell them, like that they're for families and for workers, when they really just want to shove them back out there so that their corporate partners can make bigger profits. They don't really care about our health and livelihood. They just want us to be able to trudge along and go to work. And that's what we've heard from Republicans across the state of Florida as they cut this month the federal bonus for unemployment, because so many of the hospitality industries, which typically underpay their workers, are struggling to get workers in. So for me, I just am working on helping people understand that there's an alternative, that this is not just a purely red district, that the things that they actually care about are what Democrats are pushing and want to vote for, and that the Republicans are just feeding them lies. And the long and short of it is that I got to get in front of people and I got to get them to like me and to listen to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the key, isn't it? Name recognition means a whole lot in politics. When you came in there, I was showing a clip from Brianna Joy Gray, who was kind of going into some of the disappointments that progressives might have with Biden or with some of the establishment members in the Senate, and I'm curious how it seems like sometimes people who have genuine progressive values, or at least espouse them, maybe capitulate to Republicans once they're in office. And again, whether that's intentional or not, or it's more of a dynamic of, you know what I mean, how Congress is operating right now, it can be very frustrating for us progressives and kind of disheartening, right? Like if we put all this effort into a campaign and we're volunteering and donating, and then the person gets in and maybe capitulates to Republicans or doesn't fight as hard as we would like for the policies that they were elected to fight for. So I'm curious what your strategy is to kind of combat that very difficult dynamic that we currently have in Congress should you win. How do you make sure to be a voice that is opposing sort of rolling over to the Republicans or negotiating ourselves down when we could be taking bold steps in the right direction?
Yeah, well, I mean, I 100% agree that with the Democratic majority in the U.S. House of Representatives and that, plus one vote in the Senate, that we should be able to get a lot more things done than we see happening right now. And I think it is because Democrats, we want to be good guys. Right. We want to get everybody on board. We want a coalition build. And I really wholeheartedly understand that. And I believe that. But the thing is when you have people who have no intention of getting in the coalition with you, and they have every intention of red pilling your bill with a bunch of stuff that they're not going to vote for in the end anyway, there's really not a lot of point in getting them to the table, because they're about power and consolidation of power and ensuring that as many Democratic and progressive policies fail, and they can pin as much of the failure of those policies on Joe Biden so they can get their Trump or Trump crony in 2024.
Yeah, it very clearly is and this isn't unique to the United States. We see this in the UK too, where conservative parties, when they take hold, they will basically like defund a program to the point of failure and then point at, see, government healthcare doesn't work because we defunded it and now it doesn't work, right? And I think that's definitely something that has to be fought. But it also seems, when we do take power like we have right now, you have Democratic White House, Democrat, and I get the Senate majority is very slim, but also a majority in the House. It seems like then maybe there's a little bit too much of a willingness to try to cooperate with Republicans when they, at every step, whenever they have power, they just basically tell us to pound sand. And, I'm curious, like, how do you walk a line there of trying to be a good faith negotiator and trying to like work within the system of who's elected and that kind of thing, and also sort of, I don't know, not giving the Republicans too much credit in terms of their being willing to work with us, if that kind of makes sense. I don't know if you have much to say about that, but.
Well, I think what you said something really important there, and that good faith negotiation, right? It's not a good faith negotiation when people are coming to the table with absolutely no intention of getting to a compromise. Listen, I worked in the Senate during the era of bipartisanship in the early 2000s, and where senators would call each other out publicly and say, hey, you're not acting bipartisan. It was like a dirty word on Capitol Hill during that era. And a lot of things got done, and there was a lot of compromise. And that's actually what's best for the American people, is if we can get to a point where, different perspectives are laid out and we come up with a good plan. The problem is right now is that's not happening. There is no negotiation in good faith because one side, the Republicans, do not want to negotiate. They do not want to compromise. They want to consolidate their power, just like we see in authoritarian states all over the world. This is a strategy on their behalf. They get donations from it. They go on Fox News and they pump it up because it's something that they enjoy. It's owning the libs, and we're not going to let them do this. And we really do need to be strong and say, hey, these are the things that we need to do. We need to fund our government fully. We need to make programs that are good for the American people. We need to pass the American Families Plan. We need to pass the American Jobs Plan. And we need to make sure that people are taken care of over the corporate profits, which, by the way, highly, highly fund the Republicans, much more so than most of the Democrats. And you can find all of that on the FEC website. And those types of decisions are what drives the decisions of the people in Congress, whether or not they're getting additional dollars. Just think about it in terms of buying influence rather than a dollar-to-dollar ratio.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's a lot of these corporations try to donate to everybody they possibly can to buy as much influence up as they possibly can, right? It really is just how much leverage can I have over the policymakers. My favorite story to point out how Republicans are just so unwilling to work with Democrats is it was Joe Biden actually who was when he was vice president for Obama, and he was negotiating with John Boehner about some policy item. I don't remember what specific one it was, but Biden gave his spiel. Here's why we think it's important. Here's where we're willing to negotiate, whatever it was, right? I'm obviously not privy to the specifics, but the quote that leaked was Boehner looked at him right after he said that and said, "You act like I care." So that's a pretty clear indication of whether or not you're willing to actually engage in any good faith negotiations at this point. So I'm a little bit astounded that Biden continues to treat Republicans as though as though there's people that we should be working with after he's had those kinds of experiences, after he, as vice president, watched Mitch McConnell very openly just say, "I'm here to obstruct. And that's what I'm going to do for the Obama years." Right. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just, I guess, frustrating for, progressives when the Democrats maybe don't fight back a little bit, right? Like you're acting in self-defense if you fight back at this point. You're not being a bad faith, negotiator. Right. So to pivot really quickly to, we talk a lot at Real Progressives about how campaigns are more than just trying to win a seat, right? Campaigns can be community building and organizing and networking and building trust among people who might not otherwise trust government or trust your party or trust you. So can you speak to those efforts and how that might help pull your district in your direction?
Well, absolutely. Listen, when I ran in this district, when I came out and said, "Hey, I want to run because I'm qualified. I'm a political science professor. I know what I'm talking about. I'm tired of dummies running this district." Everybody just tells me, "Oh yeah, it's so hard here. It's so Republican, and you're not going to get any support, no donations, no party help," and they just let it go. And we actually had an initiative here in Florida where we ran Democratic candidates in every single down ballot race for the state. So that's state house and state senate, and almost every single congressional district around the state as well, whether or not they were deemed a blue or a red seat. And I think the proof that we look at that is that the 5 districts that moved in the Democratic direction, almost all of them, I think 4 out of 5 of them were red districts that moved in the more Democratic direction. The one seat that went uncontested, which was 25, that is currently occupied by Diaz-Balart, moved from a Republican +4 to a Republican +8 because there was no Democratic dialogue there. And I think that that's really illustrative of why it's valuable to invest in campaigns, even when the numbers on paper, when you start a campaign, tell you, "Oh, this is not going to be a good situation." Because if there's no counterpoint, you get districts that become more entrenched, and you lose the opportunity to continue to have that dialogue because then you don't have the volunteers, you don't have the staff, the parties get decimated, there's no funding base, and it becomes more and more likely that you will not see a Democrat run there in the future.
Gotcha. So in Florida, is the dynamic sort of that the Democratic Party only focuses its resources and time on the few areas where they have good numbers, and then areas that are maybe those red +10 or whatever get kind of neglected? Is that kind of the dynamic down there?
Yeah. So there's a couple things going on. And one of them is what we call the golden child strategy. And that is where the ones that are, maybe flippable, that they get not like the lion's share of the resources, but all of them. And districts like mine get nothing. And that's really unfortunate, again, for that capacity building component of it. The other thing is that there's a history of kind of deal making at the state level when it comes to drawing these lines. And the Republicans have been in control of the state legislature for 20 years. And obviously they're drawing lines that are very favorable to them, but they kind of do like a wink and a nod to the Democrats and be like, "All right, these ones are your guys. These ones are ours. We're going to have as few like flippable purple seats as possible." And then everybody just stays out of everybody's way when it comes to that. So there's actually kind of like within parties, and this happened in 2020, Democrats at the state level were discouraging Democrats from running in heavily red districts to kind of preserve that piece. And that to me is just astonishing and disgusting.
Oh, I think that's a travesty. I mean, think about the long-term implications, right? It seems, unfortunately, people engage in politics on kind of an election cycle to election cycle basis instead of thinking, maybe we won't win this seat this year, but what kind of work what might we be contributing to down the road? Or what kind of infrastructure might we be contributing to, say some Senate candidate comes up, statewide race, or a governor candidate, right, who actually is progressive, and you might be creating infrastructure that helps that candidate get elected. It all kind of connects, I think. A great example of this is Nevada with some of the labor organizers there, and then the 16 and 20 campaigns, where you see this kind of grassroots organic formation of political infrastructure that can help candidates statewide. Do you see something like that as a short-term possibility in Florida, or are we quite a ways off in the state right now?
Well, listen, I have a background in community development and community organizing. So this is the way for me, as far as I can tell. Like, this is what we need to do. We need to organize. And it's you're water in a stream, right? Like, you're just, every little drop counts. You're eroding the stones with the power of the masses. And that's really important. And I think that, again, that is what we saw here in Southwest Florida. Again, a throwaway district according to the party and many of the powers that be, so to speak. But we had some of the highest turnout rates in the state, both overall, but for Democrats in particular in Collier and Lee County. And we had amazing turnout rates. I moved 50,000 votes on a very small budget. In fact, I was top in the state in terms of moving the budgets. I was the only one who did it under $1 million. And that was a testament to the organizing. And everybody, right off the bat, even though we were, it was a hard election, and then we had all the issues in Georgia, and then with the presidential election that we saw Trump stirring up, but people got right back on in the beginning of 2021 to volunteer, to organize, to do some retrospectives as how we can do it better. And I had never seen that in the 12 years that I've lived here. And so I'm really excited that we can actually do these organizing things and actually have something similar to what happened in Georgia happen here. And there are multiple organizations, multiple groups across the state that are coalescing around that as well.
That is fantastic to hear. I think so. I was worried that when Biden won, we would end up in a place where people kind of went back to sleep, and you know what I mean? Oh, we don't have to pay attention now because Trump's gone. And, so I'm very encouraged to hear that people are still engaging at the grassroots level and active in trying to push everything in the right direction. I wanted to ask you about the Florida COVID situation. This isn't something I've followed very closely, but I know that DeSantis had, was it falsified numbers or something? And Rebecca Jones, I believe her name was, who was one of the scientists working on the pandemic for the state, had called this out. And I'm still here. I apologize for my camera app, you guys. That's going to change soon. But I was hoping you could go into what's the COVID situation like right now? Has it improved? And has DeSantis been held to any account for his, I know he's not the only governor to engage in this kind of thing, but that's pretty egregious. What's coming of all that?
Oh boy. Well, yeah, this is a whole thing here in Florida. There has not been a lot of transparency at the state level on these numbers. And Rebecca Jones, who was working for the Florida Department of Health, building the dashboard for that, was asked to manipulate numbers, which, by the way, is very, very common in the state of Florida. And I can attest to that as somebody who's been a researcher in multitudes of areas, everything from education to workforce to these public health numbers. Florida just doesn't really care about telling the truth as much as they care about making things look good and keeping the economy going. And that's exactly what happened with the COVID dashboard. And so he started asking her to change the way that she was reporting things, and she did not want to do that. And then ended up going public with it, getting fired, quit, whatever. And then just recently she was given whistleblower status. So that kind of proves that internally within the Department of Health here, that they found some substantiation to her claims, and that she'll have those whistleblower protections, which there are federal protections under the Department of Labor that say that if you know of wrongdoing within your organization, particularly government organizations, you have not only the right to do so and tell everybody, but you have the duty to let people know. And she absolutely did that. What's unfortunate is there's a lot of people who have bought hook, line, and sinker. DeSantis is, oh, COVID's just fine. Everything's great. Open up, master oppression. And they, I mean, I actually got, yesterday I put a tweet out about her saying, hey, I'm glad she got whistleblower status. We have no transparency in our data here. And I think that that's important in government. And it was hundreds of DeSantis trolls were after me. And I was just like, wow, you guys are really triggered on this. And I don't think you have any idea what government transparency or data looks like to be meaningful. But yeah, we still have COVID going on here in Florida. We still have people dying. Our hospitals have been at 90% capacity and above for over a year now, teetering sometimes on 98, 99%, at least here in Southwest Florida. And we have no idea. They shut down the state dashboard. They actually, DeSantis announced just a few days ago that he's no longer going to be providing data to the CDC. They initially were going to be providing data once a week. Now they are providing no more COVID data, no data on hospitalizations, no data on child deaths, no data on how many people in prisons are dying and have COVID, no data on how many schools have been affected by COVID at all. It's just wiping it away. And this means that the researchers can't get it as well. And this will actually affect national data because Florida is not participating in this. And it's just extremely, extremely disappointing.
That's outrageous. I didn't even think about the bigger picture implications of the. I mean, obviously, this has been an accusation against Cuomo too. I believe Pennsylvania had issues with numbers and things. This is not, that all could add up to really substantially affect the national numbers and our understanding of what's actually going on with a health crisis, right? I'm curious. You have such a knowledge base in kind of social sciences and how people kind of operate, and I'm curious how you think this issue became so almost politicized or like became a culture issue, right? I know it's relatively normal when we have a vaccine come out to have 10 or 15% of the population be skeptical about it. I don't even think it's like unreasonable to be skeptical of a company like Pfizer or to be skeptical of, you know what I mean, a big pharma in general, or the regulators who are in revolving door status with big pharma, or these kind of things. I think there's a healthy level of skepticism, but this went to a place where it was conspiratorial and completely ridiculous. And I'm curious, do you think that was really just Trump having stated the things the way he said it? Or do you think there's a bigger underlying social phenomenon here that caused people to so politicize a scientific issue, a health issue?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely had a president with a megaphone to amplify ridiculous conspiracy theories that were already gaining a lot of traction online. You know, in times of uncertainty, people look for things that make sense. And a lot of people don't really understand how science works and how it's a pandemic like this is emergent. And so the information is changing constantly. The recommendations are going to change constantly because they simply don't know enough. And scientists are very cautious about what they say. They want to be fairly certain about their recommendations. But to lay people, it looks like waffling, right? And that's what we see the accusations against Fauci and against the CDC by the right. Now, what then happened is that we saw people who were scared and worried, essentially being, ginned up by Donald Trump, ginned up by QAnon, and then frankly further manipulated by other Republicans for political gain. I mean, DeSantis rode that all the way home. He's riding it into a potential 2024 presidential bid. He's hoping that everybody here will feel so upset about the masks and the vaccine passports and the cavalcade of things that they made up about COVID, that this was democratic oppression, that they'll be able to continue to consolidate their power. And it really goes down to the other factor is the trust in the government, which has been eroded over years. Like you just said, yeah, we should have skepticism of big pharma and the regulators. And that's the steel triangle or whatever it's called, because there is a relationship there, and they have failed us in the past. It doesn't mean all the time, but we have eroded that trust because politicians would rather leverage what they can for their own power rather than be truthful to the American people.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, I do think it's a difficult, like when I'm talking to somebody who might kind of believe some of the conspiratorial whatever about the vaccine, or just be particularly hesitant, or what, you know what I mean? I find myself in a tricky position because it's like, I really do. I don't love Pfizer. I don't think Pfizer has my best interest at heart. You know what I mean? I'm grateful for the scientists who actually created the vaccine. Of course, that's a whole different, but the incentive structure that's been set up for the Pfizers and Modernas, I find to be egregious. And I don't necessarily trust them to have my best interest at heart. I don't trust them not to rush a vaccine that might increase their profits, these kinds of things. So how do you bridge that gap with people who, you know what I mean, are hesitant to believe what is, you know, really reputable science? And how do we start to build some better trust in our institutions so that we can avoid some of the hesitancy on issues like this, where it actually can have serious implications on the health of the country?
Yeah, it is really hard. You know, I've found myself in the position where if somebody's really just dug in on their kind of conspiracy position, I just say, okay, you know, like that's where you are, because they're not necessarily thinking critically. They're not going to take in new information and be like, oh, well, that's a really insightful thought. That's not where they are. They're acting in a fight or flight kind of mode because they've been triggered in that way. And so we just got to kind of recognize that some folks right now are not going to be able to do that. And the best thing that we can do is to give information to people and the peers of those folks so that they can continue to, you know, let everybody know what the good science is. Actually, that's what the research has shown is with the vaccine hesitance people, it's their friends that are going to be more likely to influence them. So, you know, just talk, you know, not in an authoritative way, but just say, hey, you know, I got it. It's fine for me. And I'm happy to play this part. I think the broader question that you're asking, though, is about the government trust. And actually, there's a pretty simple idea from that. And we talked about it earlier, is if we want government institutions to work, that we need to fund them. And we need to fund them to their full capacity so that the programs can be effective. We also then need transparency. And with those two things, full funding and transparency, we will increase trust in our government. And that is what we have to do. And that's why it's so important that we stand up for these things and fund the programs and do what's good for American people, but then let them know honestly and openly about what's going on and when there are risks, and as well as when there are failures.
I think that's really key right there, is being honest about like any potential side effects or risks, because if you start to kind of cover something up, or, you know, or even in a bigger picture sense, being honest about the shortcomings of maybe a regulatory institution or of a company, right? Because if we're being honest about it, then people at least trust that we're like, when we then say, here's the science, you really should get this vaccine, we're coming from a place where they might actually, you know, view that as not being a political statement, but a scientific statement. I think that's really critical. You mentioned funding there, and I was hoping we could talk a little bit about, I know you've been on Macro and Cheese with our CEO, Steve, and talked a little bit of MMT. I think it's really, really critical for particularly members of Congress, people operating at the federal level, to understand MMT. I really think every politician and voter should understand MMT. But can you speak a little bit to how, first of all, how that's an important thing for congressional members to understand, and how the federal government actually funds these programs? And secondly, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, I kind of go back and forth on, like, to what extent do they understand it, and they're just scared to come off reckless because they know that their populace doesn't understand it. And to what extent is it a genuine, like, maybe this member of Congress used to own a business or used to work in city government and is applying that same kind of paradigm to the federal government? Do you think this is widely understood and just kind of covered up because the voters don't understand it yet? Or do you think that there's genuine confusion at the congressional level?
I genuinely think the vast majority of people in our government, I would say especially Republicans, they really think, for as much as they do that the federal budget and the economy works like a simple household budget, right? But the funny thing is, I've heard them, and I've gone around debates with other Republicans on this as well. But the funny thing is most Americans, especially those who are homeowners, they're not operating on a cash flow in, cash flow out type of budget. They all have credit. Everybody's got a mortgage. If you own a house, most people have a mortgage. They don't own it cash or out, and so they're already leveraging the credit systems that were built into this country that we were able to grow our economy on. And so, yeah, I don't think think that people have a real good grasp of it. And because it sounds so kind of fantastical for people, I think that like, oh, that there's fiat and there's, we just create currency, because people really, especially because there's like a tangible currency, people think like, oh, this is a thing. But then when it comes down to actual policies and how we fund things and how credit works and how, the diversity of our economy works, everybody just kind of assumes that there are things that we just do, right? When we bailed out the banks in 2010, 2009, we just did that, right? When we bailed out GM, we just did that. Nobody said, oh, well, we got to tax people or we got to cut back social programs for that. No, they didn't. Stimulus plans got priority, especially over the last, when we have a recession. And there's not this kind of pay-go kind of concept about how we do that. And it really goes back to the ideas that we can fund what we prioritize. We have a robust and diverse economy that, as long as we're not going buck wild beyond what we can actually continue to contribute to the global community, that we should be able to get the programs that we need. And I think it's just a matter of telling people that and using the examples of how things really work.
Yeah, I think Steve says this. He has this line that I've now started regurgitating because I think it is so perfect. He says MMT is kind of deceptively simple in the sense that people are kind of holding on to this preconceived notion about how currency operates based upon, and it's natural. I actually understand it. I did this. I had to be woken up to this, where it's like, in my experience, it's finite, and I have to go earn money before I can spend it, or I'm in debt. And it so to break that paradigm that kind of forms naturally as we experience the economy in our own lives, I think can be difficult, even though the concept itself, at least at the surface level, is really kind of deceptively simple. The money is a social construct. It's created and then taxed to eliminate it, that kind of thing, right? So do you think that this is an issue that we are close to winning a lot of people over on, in terms of getting them to understand the monetary system? Or am I just too, I'm an economics nerd and maybe I'm just in a bubble where people are starting to grasp onto this stuff in a way that I hadn't seen in previous years?
You know what? I unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic as you are on this. I think that we just got to keep instilling trust in the government and showing that when you fund programs that they work, and just let people understand that it's not the same as a household budget. It's not the same as you as an individual earner. And that's part and parcel because most Americans are like busy living their life, right? They're not policy wonks. They are not political scientists. They are not economists. They're just people who are living. And that extends beyond economics. It's most policies, right? Like, people want to have a good quality of life, and they kind of don't care how it works, but they just want it to work, and they know when it doesn't. So I talk about building a government that runs like your operating system, right? Like when you turn your phone on, your iOS just goes. That's a software program. That's a structure. Somebody put time and thought into that. Somebody funded that. That's how we want our government to work. We want the trash to go out. We want the water to turn on. We want streets that are passable. We want airports. We want to be safe. And those are all government things. And there's policy and there's debates around them. But most American people are not heavily invested in the different styles of policy. They just want it to work like their iOS.
Yeah. And that's, you bring up a great point where it's too easy. And I don't blame people at all. If you got to work 40, 50 hours a week and you're raising a family and you got to have some time for your hobbies and enjoying life too. I mean, I happen to do this professionally, so it's like I get to be involved all the time and understand this stuff, and I totally take your point. Not everyone can be so invested, and I think that's actually a broader problem where we need to create a society where people don't have to work 50-hour weeks to feed their family. You know what I mean? In a lot of European countries, they've started saying overtime at 33, 35 hours, these kinds of policies where it's like really trying to incentivize companies not to overwork their workers, and that gives you extra hours. I think people do want to engage in this stuff. They just literally don't have the time. And if you give them an extra 10 or 15 hours a week, I think they could be, much better informed on some of these issues. So the last thing that I really wanted to ask you about is just the dynamics of your campaign. How is it going? And are there a lot of candidates running here? What's the feel so far?
Well, luckily we have a lot of great down ballot candidates. We have redistricting coming up here in Florida, so it's kind of going to be a toss up about where everything lies, frankly. But it's going really well. I have building a really great team. We announced pretty early, mostly because the current senator or Republican congressional delegate here is Byron Donald. He was in the Sedition Caucus. He was at Trump's rally on January 6th. He continues to be a staunch Trump supporter. So we launched early to keep him accountable for all that, because he really likes to pretend like that stuff is not a big deal, like many of our Republican colleagues in Congress. But I said, nope, we need to rally the troops because people in our area were really despondent after that. So we announced our campaign just ahead of the inauguration of President Joe Biden. And we have been building momentum ever since, building the coalitions, because grassroots candidates, that's what we have to do. We have to build networks and coalitions and get other people on board. And we've been doing that and starting up our fundraising. And we're just really looking forward to things getting back to normal as pandemic numbers are starting to go down. Luckily in Florida, it's warm, so we can stay outside and stay distanced from folks and get to meet people and have a more connected race here for 2022.
That sounds fantastic. And can you just give a few of your top, I know there's so many that it's almost hard to choose, but can you give a few of your top policy priorities and why you think those are the important things for us to be focusing on right now? What will your attention be on if you win this seat?
Yes. So for us here in Southwest Florida, we're always talking about water quality. We have kind of a perennial fight with the federal government about funding Everglades restoration, as well as doing some restoration around the Lake Okeechobee water releases and negotiating with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so that'll be a priority, as well as supporting the small businesses that are affected when those polluted waters come down our way. Healthcare is going to continue to be a big issue for me. I think that we're not going to get to it in the 117th Congress, so it's going to be up in time in the 118th Congress. And as a mother of a child who had a rare blood disease that nearly bankrupted my family, I think that no American should be going bankrupt because of healthcare, and that we really need to streamline that system and move towards a model where everyone can access healthcare affordably, and that there is a federal component to that. Additionally, I'm always looking at jobs. So that's the thing for us. Small businesses in particular, I will say, not the big guys, the micro guys, because there's also an equity component to that. If you look at small businesses, micro businesses, 91% of Black-owned small businesses are those micro businesses, and those are the ones that are feeding families. So we need to have some dollars to help those businesses as well, especially all of them that shuttered during the COVID pandemic.
That is a fantastic list of priorities. I totally agree. And I think jobs is, a federal job guarantee for me is one of the most important policies, because it would bridge that gap a little bit, where if the private sector is actually not able to employ a certain number of people, we would at least be providing them a job, right? And I think jobs is important. Healthcare is important. All this stuff is in water. We can't live without water. That's a pretty darn important issue, right? Well, I want to encourage everybody to check out, it's cindybanyai.com. is her campaign page if you want to learn more about her and her policy priorities. And I want to wish Cindy luck in her campaign. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we can do this again. Thanks for taking the time today.
Absolutely, Luke. Thanks for having me here.
All righty. So I have one more story that I did want to get to before I let everybody go today. And it is the Krystal and Saagar leaving the Hill. So Krystal and Saagar were the hosts of Rising for a couple of years. I have used their clips on a regular basis, and I think they did some fantastic work. However, they recently decided to leave the Hill because the Hill was disallowing them from having certain guests on, including Kyle Kalinske, who was apparently disallowed from coming on the show, even though he got good numbers when he did go on the show. And they also were not allowing Krystal and Saagar to promote their own podcasts on the show or mention their own podcasts on the show. There was some content regulation that clearly was going on because the Hill is a corporation. So they decided to leave and start their own show. And I thought this was a very critical story because Krystal and Saagar kind of tried to bridge that. Like they had an advantage in the YouTube algorithm because they were with the Hill. So they weren't treated like independent, even though a lot of their coverage came off a lot more independent. They were very critical of the establishment in many ways. For those that don't know, Krystal is kind of a left-wing populist and Saagar is kind of a right-wing populist, but they're both very critical of the establishment and corruption and these institutional issues that we talk about on a regular basis. So it was a little bit rare to have a corporation like The Hill putting a show like this on. And now it's clear that even though they were perhaps going further than a lot of other corporate outlets are willing to go, they were regulating content on Krystal and Saagar. So I want to show you guys a short clip here of them explaining to Marshall Kozlov and Kyle Kulinski why they left, and then we'll come back and discuss.
I mean, let's just get right to it. The big news dropped. Krystal and Saagar, you guys are no longer with The Hill. I don't think anybody saw this coming. I think because the show's going strong, the numbers are phenomenal, but all of a sudden now. So tell everybody, why'd you leave The Hill?
What do you think, Krystal? Why did we leave The Hill?
I mean, honestly, the reason is really simple. And first of all, I have to say, like, we had an amazing experience at The Hill. Rising was, you know, the work of a lifetime to get to create that show and what we got to do every day and the interaction with the audience, like all of that was absolutely amazing. But at bottom, we wanted to live our values. We talk all the time about how much we believe in the new media ecosystem, how much we believe in independent media free of any sort of corporate influence. And so even though I have to admit, like, I'm really nervous and it feels very uncomfortable, but in a good way, we wanted to step out and go independent and do a show of our own.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing with Rising. We loved it. It's amazing that they let us get away with as much as we got away with for 2 years.
True.
At the end of the day, though, I wanted to do a better show. And the way that The Hill works, the business model and all of that, it's just not engineered to our best strengths, which is that The Hill is about volume because it's all just clicks, right? And what we wanted to do is we see the rise of subscription media. We see exactly like how independent media can work with a dedicated audience. And what do we really love doing, Krystal? It's not just chasing clicks or having to cover something for the sake of simply filling a show, right? We want to cover whatever we think is important. Sometimes that's the housing market, sometimes UFOs, Epstein, Bill Gates. I'm not going to lie. Of course, that stuff does really well. One of my favorite radars I ever did at Rising was about semiconductors. And I mean, I think it got like 85,000 views. And if that had been all I wanted to do, or like maybe like there was a week where I thought that was really important, that just would not have been like financially sustainable there. But in the new media ecosystem, it is. Whatever we think is important is financially sustainable in a subscription-based model. And so at the end of the day, just the way that things were diverging and like you could see the rise of new media, we could see that we could have total editorial control. We could be our own bosses, not have to chase, in my opinion, a dying, defunct, and not as good model for us or for the audience. It was like a total no-brainer.
So that was kind of a softer explanation than they went into later in that discussion, where they explained the sort of direct censorship that The Hill had engaged in. But I think Saagar says it right there. I wanted to do a better show. I love that. I love that they're just willing to be like, look, you're constraining our ability to do a better show. We want to do a better show. Get away from the corporation, right? So I'm very much looking forward to them starting their new show, Breaking Points. And I wanted to talk about this in the context of independent media in general. And I think this is a big portion of why the corporate models are starting to show such failure. I've talked recently about how cable news ratings have tanked CNN's ratings as bad as they have been in a very long time. MSNBC trying to get into the podcast game, but they're doing so with Nicole Wallace as their like flagship host, which if you're targeting a younger audience, Nicole Wallace is not the person that you like. They clearly seem to think that their content is not the problem, that it's just a platform issue, right? People are just unplugged from cable. As soon as we go online, they'll follow us, right? It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. But it speaks to the bigger picture sort of migration of audiences from these corporate sources to independent sources. And I think a lot of the root of that is that people recognize that a corporate source has their own incentives built in to their business model by their, nature. The corporation is there to make money. They're not there to provide, objective or ethical journalism or commentary or news. In fact, the extent to which they care about the content is the extent to which it benefits or harms their business model. So they want to espouse a certain version of politics that is beneficial to their bottom line. And that comes out in their commentary and in their coverage and in their content. And then they turn around and think that's not the problem. We just need to unplug, right? So I'm encouraged by people's movement towards independent sources because that seems to be a recognition of the incentive structure set up by corporate media sources. I've quoted this before, but Rush Limbaugh actually acknowledged, he said, my job is to fill the gap between the advertisers. My job is to keep people listening between the advertising segments, right? So he acknowledged, like, my job is not to provide quality content. My job is just to keep people listening. And that's how cable news has gone from being anything that resembled journalism or commentary to being just pure entertainment, right? There's not even an attempt to engage in ethical or objective journalism on these channels anymore. So I want to congratulate Krystal and Saagar for taking this leap, getting the kind of ratings they were getting, and deciding to cast away the mechanism that was giving them those ratings is not an easy decision to make, and I think it is admirable. That they will be able to do a higher quality show and potentially bring on, like, they spent 2 years at the Hill, and now they're going to try to bring some of that audience over to a higher quality, less constrained, more independent, more open show is, I think, absolutely fantastic. They also, just as a quick little funny side bit, they said later in that interview, I've talked to on my show before, Ira Miose Frimpong. He's known as the Funky Academic. For those that don't follow him, he's fantastic. He's a doctoral student at the University of Georgia. He's a regular guest, or was, on Rising. And Krystal and Saagar joked about how, like, every time he would come on, we'd have to, like, hold our breath because he might say something that the Hill doesn't like, Well, now they can have him on and ask him anything, and he can actually just give a, you know what I mean? So removing that, even when you have a good actor, we're all human beings. So if your boss tells you, like, you need to not cover this in this way, even if you really don't want to follow that instruction, you know what I mean? There's this kind of natural, we're human beings kind of a incentive. It's like how Bezos can say all he wants. I instruct my reporters at the Washington Post not to cover me differently than they would cover anyone else. And he claims that that's the case, that he tells them, do not take into account that, I'm your boss or that I own Amazon or any of this crap. Well, you can say that until the cows come home, and people are still going to write the article differently when it's about their fucking boss. So there's these kind of natural incentive structures that human beings are just susceptible to falling into, that work against providing that quality content, that objective commentary in journalism. And I think that the independent model is a way around a lot of that, where you can avoid those kind of pressures and incentives being forced upon you. And that is why I do what I do. That is why I follow a lot of independent sources and get my news and commentary from independent sources, because I do not trust for a second the corporations that own the vast majority of our mainstream and legacy media. So last little funny bit, you guys. This is quite hilarious. Oh, 1 second. I am sorry. I'm new to StreamYard. Hold on. Here we go. Ken Klippenstein. If you do not know Ken Klippenstein, go follow Ken Klippenstein on Twitter. He is the best person at Twitter in the world, I swear. He does a prank annually on Memorial Day where he posts Lee Harvey Oswald in a military uniform and tweets out to conservative politicians that this is his grandfather and that his grandfather is a big fan of said politician. Would you please share this tweet in honor of my grandfather on Memorial Day? A lot of them do not recognize Lee Harvey Oswald, and as a result, share the tweet, and then Ken will often change his name on Twitter to something that makes fun of that politician. So at one point, it was Ted Cruz liked a porn tweet. I'm sure you guys remember when Ted Cruz account liked a porn tweet. So, Ken gets him to share this Lee Harvey Oswald picture and then changes his name to Ted Cruz liked a porn tweet. And now that's on Ted Cruz's Twitter feed. Ken is brilliant. He got Candace Owens to respond to this prank this year. Candace says, "You are making a mockery of a day that is meant to memorialize men that died so that you and other anti-American leftists can laugh at their sacrifices by photoshopping a murderer into their uniforms." Photoshopping. She doesn't know that Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marine. "You are deranged, as is any person applauding your efforts." Ken, with a brilliant response here, he says, "Would not have guessed you cared so much about being politically correct." Candace's whole shtick is the left is too PC, right? Now she's the one demanding that Ken be PC. How dare you say something so offensive, right? So she comes back and says, "It is not political correctness to have a soul and a modicum of decency." Reminder, these men died, the majority of them on foreign soil, so that you could be free. You do not Photoshop murderers into their uniforms so that you can have a laugh. First of all, our military policy has nothing to do with our freedom. Most of the soldiers that we send overseas to die are dying for our corporate causes and for the military-industrial complex. So that's just brazenly inaccurate. Second of all, it's not political correctness to have a soul and a modicum of decency. Who gets to decide what the modicum of decency is, Candace? That's exactly political correctness. That's exactly political correctness. Hilarious. So Ken says, "I, for one, believe in free speech." I just wanted to bring you guys that because I found it absolutely hilarious. And again, if you do not follow Ken Klippenstein on Twitter, I encourage you to. He's a journalist, does fantastic work in his own regard, but he is also absolutely fucking hilarious and pranks people all the time in these kinds of ways. So that is it for the show this week, you guys. I appreciate you tuning in and look forward to seeing everybody next week. I want to once again plug Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. Please follow us on Twitter at RP_in_action and at Real Progress US. Go to our website, realprogressives.org, if you want to learn more about our organization or contribute to our organization. And don't forget to get involved with that March for Medicare for All on July 24th that is happening in cities across the nation. If you're not able to get involved, then tune into our coverage of the march. Really excited to be pushing for such a no-brainer policy that we desperately need in this country and have desperately needed for a very long time. So once again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see everybody next week.